The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, every soul in Harlan Creek, Texas knew that Robert Ellsworth had refused another woman. It was the fourth one in as many months, and the townsfolk had begun placing quiet bets at Delmont's saloon about whether the man would ever take a wife at all. Some said he was too proud. Others said he was still grieving. Old Mabel Prout, who ran the post office and knew more about everyone's business than they knew themselves, said he was simply afraid, though she had the good sense to say it only in whispers. Robert Ellsworth was 32 years old in the autumn of 1882, and he owned the finest cattle spread in Crockett County. 1,600 acres of red Texas earth, a solid house with a stone fireplace, 2 good barns, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse for his hired hands, and more longhorn cattle than he could count on a slow afternoon. By every measure a man could use, he had built something real and lasting from ground that had once been nothing but mesquite scrub and dry creek beds. His father had started the work, and Robert had finished it, pouring 10 years of his own blood and sweat into the land until it became something more than a farm. It became a home, or at least it had the shape of one. The missing piece was obvious to everyone, including Robert himself. His ranch foreman, a weathered, straight-backed man named Caleb Hurst, had been the one to first suggest the arrangement. It had been nearly 2 years since Robert's mother passed, leaving the big house emptier than ever, and Caleb had come to him one morning over coffee and said plainly that a man needed a wife to make a house a home, and that there were reputable agencies in the East that arranged such things with care and discretion. Robert had listened without argument, which Caleb had taken as agreement, and the process had begun. The first woman was named Clara Hutchins, a schoolteacher from Ohio. She was polite, neat, and thoroughly reasonable. She had arrived on the stage in May, and Robert had met her at the depot with his hat in his hand and his manners intact. They had shared a meal at the hotel dining room, and she had talked about education and the importance of civilizing the frontier, and Robert had sat very still and felt nothing that a man ought to feel when he looked at the woman he was meant to marry. He had thanked her, paid for her return journey, and written the agency a courteous letter explaining that the arrangement was not a suitable match. The second woman, sent in July, was Margaret Foss, a widow from Virginia with 2 children. She was warm and practical, and the children were well behaved. Robert had genuinely liked her. He had spent 3 days showing her the ranch, answering her questions honestly, and watching her look at everything with the careful eyes of a woman who knew how to calculate a future. She had liked him too, he thought. But liking was not what either of them needed, and they had both known it by the 3rd evening. He had paid her passage home and written to the agency again. The third woman, sent in September, had taken one look at the Texas heat, the red dust that coated everything in a fine permanent layer, the distance to the nearest town, and the sheer rawness of the land, and had asked to be taken back to the depot before her trunk was even unloaded. Robert had not argued, and the fourth woman, the one whose rejection had fueled Wednesday morning's gossip, had been a perfectly lovely young woman named Harriet Cole, who had made it very clear over their first supper that she expected the ranch to be sold within 5 years, so that her future husband could take up a more refined profession in a city. Robert had set down his fork, dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and very gently explained that the ranch was not something he was willing to sell at any price in any year, and that he was sorry for any confusion the agency might have caused about his intentions. So that was 4 women, 4 departures, and one increasingly exasperated cattle rancher, who had begun to wonder if perhaps the whole endeavor had been a mistake from the beginning. He had written to the agency and sent Louis Hartwell and Morris Matrimonial Services, Est 1871, and told them in plain language that he would not be requiring their services any further. He had meant it, and he had folded the letter himself and handed it to Mabel Prout with the finality of a man closing a door. What he had not known, because the letter crossed in the post with one already in transit, was that a fifth woman had already been dispatched. Frances Merriweather had not come through Hartwell and Morris. That was the part nobody understood at first, not even Frances herself. She had applied to a different agency entirely, a smaller, newer outfit called the Western Star Placement Bureau, run by a woman named Dorothea Klein out of a cramped office in Cincinnati, Ohio. Frances had been 26 years old, a bookkeeper's daughter with an education her father had insisted upon, and a life that had grown too small for the shape of her ambitions. She could read Latin, do mathematics in her head, speak clearly and without apology, and had read enough about the Western territories to know that the frontier, for all its hardships, offered women something the crowded cities of the East increasingly did not: room. Room to breathe, room to grow, room to matter in ways that the narrow roles available to an unmarried woman in Cincinnati did not allow. Her father, Benjamin Merriweather, had been a bookkeeper himself, a gentle, precise man who had taught her to love numbers and order and honesty. He had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1881, leaving Frances with a modest inheritance, a small apartment she could no longer afford on her own, and the quiet, pressing understanding that something in her life needed to change. She had held the grief for a year, worked as a seamstress to keep herself fed, and then on a cold January morning in 1882, she had walked into Dorothea Klein's office and said that she was ready. Dorothea had placed her in correspondence with a rancher in Kansas who had seemed promising, but whose letters had grown increasingly peculiar over the months. He had eventually revealed that he kept 17 cats in his house and refused to eat any meal that contained onions, which Frances felt she could have overlooked individually, but together constituted a character profile she could not commit to. The Kansas arrangement had dissolved, and Dorothea had cast about for another match. The paperwork confusion, as Frances later understood it, happened because Dorothea Klein and Morris Hartwell had a long-standing arrangement by which they occasionally shared client profiles across agencies when a particularly promising match seemed likely, and the right candidate was not in-house. Morris Hartwell had, in a moment of administrative optimism, and without checking whether Robert Ellsworth had recently withdrawn from their services, included Robert's profile in a batch of materials sent to Dorothea in early October. Dorothea had matched it to Frances without knowing the man had already declined further arrangements, and Frances had received a packet of information about a cattle rancher in Crockett County, Texas, with a photograph that showed a serious-faced man squinting into the sunlight beside a fence post, hat pushed back on his head, with something in the line of his jaw that suggested he was a person who meant what he said. Frances had written him a letter. Just one, because she had always believed in making a clear impression the first time. She had told him plainly who she was, where she came from, what she knew and what she did not know, what she was willing to learn, and what she was not willing to pretend. She had told him she was not looking for rescue or comfort or a guaranteed easy life. She had told him she was looking for a partner, and that she understood the difference between a partner and a housekeeper wearing a ring. She had sealed the letter and posted it and felt, inexplicably, very calm. The letter had arrived at the Ellsworth Ranch on a day when Robert was out repairing fence line, and Caleb had collected the mail from town. It sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before Robert noticed it, mixed in among seed catalogs and a notice from the county assessor. He had almost thrown it away unopened, because the handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar and the return address was Cincinnati, which he associated with nothing in his life. Something had made him open it. He would not have been able to explain what that something was. He read the letter standing at the kitchen table, still in his work coat, dirt on his boots. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stood very still for a long moment, looking at the window without seeing anything outside it. He picked it up and read it a third time. Then he went to find Caleb. "Did you write to Hartwell and Morris on my behalf?" he asked when he found the foreman in the barn. Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending and said with perfect innocence, "Not recently." "Then who is Frances Merriweather?" Caleb took the letter when Robert held it out, read it in the dusty afternoon light coming through the barn door, and when he was finished, he had the particular expression of a man who was trying very hard not to show that he was pleased with himself. "Well," he said, "she sounds like a sensible woman." "She sounds like a woman who doesn't pull punches," Robert said. "Same thing in my experience." Robert took the letter back and folded it along its original creases. He did not write back that day. He wrote back 4 days later because it took him that long to decide what to say, and because he was not a man who committed words to paper without meaning them. He wrote her an honest letter. He told her about the ranch, the land, the work. He told her about the 4 women who had come and gone, and why each arrangement had not succeeded, which was perhaps an unusual thing to include in a letter to a woman you were considering meeting. But he thought she deserved the truth about the situation she was walking into. He told her that he was not sure he believed in the agency arrangement as a concept, but that her letter had said things he hadn't expected to hear, and that if she was willing to make the journey south to Texas, he was willing to have a genuine conversation. He did not promise her anything beyond the conversation, because he was an honest man. Frances received his letter on a Thursday in late October and sat down at her small kitchen table and read it in the gray morning light and felt something shift in her chest, a feeling she did not have a precise name for but that she associated with the sensation of a door opening in a room she had forgotten was there. She wrote back immediately. She said she appreciated his honesty, that she found it unusual and quite welcome, and that she would arrange passage to Texas. She arrived in Harlan Creek on the 9th of November, 1882, on the afternoon stage from San Antonio. Robert had not received a telegram warning him she was coming. This was the second administrative failure of the affair. Dorothea Klein had sent the telegram, but it had been misaddressed to Harlan Creek's general store rather than the post office, and the storekeeper, a distracted man named Gus Albright who had 4 children under the age of 6 and a wife laid up with fever, had placed it in a stack of papers and forgotten about it entirely. So when the stage rolled into Harlan Creek that November afternoon in a cloud of red dust, and the creak of leather and iron, Robert Ellsworth was in town simply because he had come in to collect a special order of hardware from the supply store. He was standing on the boardwalk outside Albright's general store with a crate of bolts at his feet, talking to the county sheriff, a laconic man named Dade Moorfield, about the matter of a stretch of stolen fence wire when the stage pulled up at the depot across the street. He was not paying attention to it. He had no reason to. What made him look was the sound of a carpetbag hitting the boardwalk with a definitive thud, followed by a clear, unhurried voice saying to the stage driver, "Thank you. Yes, I can manage it." And then the owner of that voice stepped down from the stage onto the dusty street of Harlan Creek, and Robert Ellsworth looked at her, and every single thought he had been carrying in his head simply stopped. She was not what he had expected. She was not fragile or decorative or dressed as though she had arrived to impress. She wore a practical dark blue traveling dress that had clearly done some traveling, a coat that was good quality and well-maintained but not fussy, and a hat pinned firmly against the wind with the competence of a woman who understood that pins needed to be doing actual work. She was not tall, but she stood in a way that made the space around her take notice. Her dark hair was pinned up under the hat, and a few pieces of it had come loose in the wind, and she was not bothering with them. Her face was, Robert thought, the kind of face that you could look at for a long time and keep finding new things in it. Not conventionally beautiful in the way a portrait painter would mean the word, but alive in a way that made everything else around it seem slightly less vivid by comparison. She picked up her carpetbag, set her small trunk to the side for the driver to bring down, looked up at the street of Harlan Creek with the clear, unsentimental gaze of a woman taking accurate inventory of where she had arrived, and then her eyes landed on Robert. He was still staring at her. He was aware that he was staring and that he had not moved, and that Sheriff Moorfield had stopped talking mid-sentence and was now looking at him with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something mildly astonishing. Frances's expression shifted in a way Robert could not quite read from across the street. Then she squared her shoulders, picked up her carpetbag, and walked directly across the street toward him. "You're Robert Ellsworth," she said, when she was close enough that he did not have to shout. It was not a question, he found his voice. "I am," he said, "and you're Frances Merriweather." She extended her hand, which he shook because her manner made it absolutely the natural thing to do. "I'm sorry. I thought you would have received the telegram by now." "I didn't," he said. "The telegram didn't come." He paused. "I'm glad you came anyway." There was a brief silence between them, and in that silence Robert became aware that Sheriff Moorfield was watching the entire exchange with undisguised interest, and that Mabel Pruitt, who had been sweeping the post office doorway across the street, had stopped sweeping. He was also aware that his heart was beating with an urgency that he had absolutely no explanation for, and that he was still holding his hat in his hands. He had taken it off when she extended her hand and had not put it back on. "I need to collect my trunk," Frances said. "I'll help you," he said. "You don't have to, Miss Merriweather," he said. "I didn't know you were coming. I have nothing arranged, and you've just traveled God knows how many miles on a stagecoach. The very least I can do is help with your trunk." She looked at him for a moment with those clear, direct eyes of hers, and then one corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile, which did not help at all with the situation his heart was currently in. "All right," she said. He helped her with the trunk. He also, because there was no hotel in Harlan Creek that was respectable enough for the arrangement he had in mind, went directly to find Mabel Pruitt and asked if Frances could board with her for the short term, which Mabel agreed to with such enthusiasm that Robert suspected she had been waiting for this exact scenario for some time. He arranged for Frances's trunk to be brought to Mabel's house, and then he took his hat in his hands again and asked Frances Merriweather if she would do him the honor of joining him for supper that evening, to which she said yes with the same calm directness that seemed to characterize everything she did. He spent the intervening 2 hours in a state that bore no resemblance to the measured, rational state he had been in during every previous meeting, with every previous woman the agencies had sent. He did not know what to call the state he was in, but he recognized, distantly and with something like alarm, that he had never been in it before. Caleb, who had come into town in the wagon and witnessed most of the scene at the depot from a discreet distance, found him outside the hardware store an hour later and said absolutely nothing, which Robert found more unsettling than commentary would have been. "Go ahead," Robert said. "I haven't said anything," Caleb said. "You're thinking it very loudly." "I'm just thinking," Caleb said with great innocence, "that you forgot to put your hat back on." Robert put his hat on. Supper was at the hotel dining room, which was the best the town could offer and was, in Frances's measured opinion, quite adequate. She had known better places and she had known worse, and the truth was she was less interested in the room than in the man sitting across the table from her, who was behaving, she thought, in a manner that was notably different from what his letter had prepared her for. His letter had been careful, thoughtful, and composed, the letter of a man in control of his words and his impressions. The man in front of her now was all of that, and also something else, something that showed in the slight tension in his jaw and the way his hands were very deliberately still on the table, as though they had been told to behave. He was, she thought with quiet amusement, nervous. That surprised her, and she found she liked it. He was broader across the shoulders than the photograph had shown, with a face that the Texas sun had marked with lines around the eyes and a weathered quality that made him look like a man who had been present for serious things. His eyes were a color that kept changing between gray and a very dark blue depending on the light, and they were watching her with an attentiveness that she found, after a moment's consideration, not uncomfortable. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with arrangement of features and everything to do with something underneath, a quality of integrity. She would have called it if she were choosing a word, though she was aware that was a large word to attach to a man she had known for 3 hours. "You look as though you're solving a problem," he said after a while. She looked up. "I was thinking," she said. "About." She decided that his own letter had been honest enough that she owed him the same. "I was thinking that you are not what I expected." "In what way?" "You're nervous," she said. "Your letter was not the letter of a nervous man." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him decide not to deny it. "I wasn't warned you were coming," he said. "I had made myself," he paused. "I had made myself a certain kind of ready for a meeting I knew was coming. This caught me differently." "Is that a problem?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." They talked for 3 hours. Not about marriage or arrangements or the future in any formal sense, but about everything else. About his father, who had started the ranch with $100 and a stubborn belief in the land. About her father, the bookkeeper, who had taught her to see the world in terms of what things actually cost and what they were actually worth, and how those two numbers were almost never the same. About books they had read and places they had not been, and opinions they held about things that other people considered settled. She told him that she had very strong opinions about the accounting of cattle operations, and that she had read extensively about ranch economics during the 3 months she had spent preparing for this journey, which made him blink and then laugh, a genuine, startled laugh that changed his whole face. "Nobody has ever told me that before," he said. "That they'd read about cattle economics. That it was something worth reading about," he said. "Most people find the subject boring." "Exactly. Most people," Frances said crisply, "have not had to keep themselves solvent on a seamstress's wages while calculating whether the math of moving to Texas made sense." She paused. "It did, for what it's worth. The math." He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something between admiration and wonder, as though she were a feature of the landscape he had not expected to encounter, but which now seemed, on reflection, entirely reasonable that it should be there. She stayed in Harlan Creek, boarding with Mabel Prout, whose spare room was clean and whose opinions were inexhaustible. Robert came to call the following morning, hat in hand, standing at Mabel's front door with the directness of a man who had thought things through overnight and arrived at a position. He asked if Frances would like to see the ranch. She said she would. The drive out was 8 miles of red caliche road through flat Texas scrubland, past stands of live oak and mesquite, and through 2 shallow creek crossings. And Frances sat in the wagon beside him and watched the country open up around her with the attentive eyes of a woman, cataloging what she was actually seeing rather than what she had expected to see. It was not pretty in any conventional sense. This country, it was vast and dry and uncompromising, with a sky so enormous overhead that it made a person feel both very small and, paradoxically, quite free. She had not expected to like it as immediately as she did. "You're quiet," Robert said. "I'm looking," she said. He nodded, as though this was the right answer, which she thought was promising. The ranch was better than she had allowed herself to expect. The house was solid and well-proportioned, built from limestone with a covered porch running the full front length and windows that actually fit their frames, which she had learned from Dorothea Klein's files was not a guaranteed feature of Western ranch houses. The barns were large and in good repair, the yard was orderly, and the whole of the place had the feeling of a property that was genuinely cared for rather than merely maintained. Caleb Hurst met them in the yard. He was a tall man of around 50, with a straight-backed military bearing and a quiet, watchful manner, and he shook Frances's hand with a gravity that she appreciated. He said, "Miss Merriweather, we're glad to have you," with a simplicity that made her believe him. Robert showed her everything, And she asked the kind of questions that made him look at her sideways with an expression of reassessment, questions about water rights and the condition of the South pasture, about the arrangement with the buyer in San Antonio, about the cost and timing of the spring and fall drives. He answered every question honestly, and she understood every answer. And when they finally sat on the front porch in the November afternoon light with coffee that Caleb's wife, a sturdy, cheerful woman named Bess, had brought out, Frances looked across the red country spreading away from the house and felt something settle in her, like the last page of a long calculation finally coming out to a whole number. "Tell me about the women who left," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. "Why?" "Because understanding what didn't work usually tells you more than understanding what did," she said. So he told her. All four of them, honestly, without making himself the blameless party in any of the accounts. He had been inflexible about the ranch, he acknowledged. He had perhaps expected each woman to simply accept the reality of the land without being given time to come to terms with it. He had not been particularly warm, because he did not know how to be warm with strangers, and that was a flaw he was aware of. He had not, in any of the four cases, felt the particular thing that he thought ought to be there. "What thing?" Frances asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The thing that makes you want to stay in a room," he said, which was as precisely as he seemed able to put it, and Frances thought that for a man who was not warm with strangers, that was a remarkably honest thing to say. "I understand," she said. And she did. The days that followed had a rhythm that Frances had not anticipated. She had expected, given the formal nature of the arrangement, a certain careful distance, the measured performance of two people evaluating each other. Instead, what developed was something more like the steady, natural accumulation of a friendship, except that it ran warmer than friendship and had an undercurrent that she was honest enough with herself to recognize. Robert came to Mabel's every morning, and they drove out to the ranch, and she spent her days learning the operation in a systematic, practical way that seemed to both amuse and impress him. She worked alongside Bess in the kitchen, and learned that Bess Hurst had been on this land for 15 years and knew more about running a ranch household than most people knew about anything. She rode out with Robert to check the cattle, which required him to teach her things she had never needed to know before, and which she absorbed with the same brisk competence she brought to everything. On the third day, she fell off her horse. Not badly. The horse shied at a startled quail, and Frances, who had not been riding long, went sideways and landed in the dry grass. She was up and dusting herself off before Robert had fully registered what happened, and when he was there beside her, hands on her arms, asking if she was all right, she said, "Yes, I lost my center. I'll know not to do that again," which made him look at her with that expression. She was beginning to recognize the one that meant she had done something he had not expected. "Most people," he said, "say they are all right even when they're not. I am actually all right," she said, "although my pride is somewhat embarrassed." "Your pride has nothing to be embarrassed about," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, gone a little lower and more careful, and he was still holding her arms. They were very close in the dry grass of the South pasture, and Frances was aware of this with a clarity that was somewhat distracting. His eyes were doing the thing where they were more gray than blue, and she thought, with the lucid, slightly helpless precision that she brought to most things, that she was in some danger. He seemed to arrive at the same conclusion at approximately the same moment, because he released her arms and stepped back and looked away at the middle distance. "We should get back," he said. "It'll be dark in an hour." "Yes," she said, "we should." They did not speak much on the ride back, but it was the kind of silence that is not empty. On the sixth evening, Mabel Pruitt sat Frances down over tea and gave her the full history of Robert Ellsworth in the particular way that small-town women of a certain age convey information, which is to say completely, and without omitting the parts that are complicated. She told her about his mother, Eleanor, who had held the ranch together through years of drought and cattle prices so low it broke men's spirits, and who had died 14 months ago after a long decline. She told her that Robert had nursed her through it himself, largely alone, because his two older sisters had married and moved away, one to Louisiana, one to California, and that the loneliness of the ranch after his mother's passing had a quality to it that was not just ordinary solitude. "He is not a cold man," Mabel said firmly, as though correcting a rumor. "He is a man who learned to be careful with what he gives, because giving too much to the wrong thing costs you. He gave everything to this ranch and to his mother, and there is a great deal left, but he doesn't know what to do with it." Frances held her cup in both hands and listened. "The women the agency sent," Mabel continued, "they weren't wrong women, they just weren't the right one. And I have known Robert Ellsworth since he was 11 years old, and I can tell you that the way he looks at you is not the way he looked at any of them." Frances was quiet for a moment. "How does he look at me?" Mabel smiled, and it was not a gentle smile but a direct one. "Like he's afraid you're going to disappear," she said. Frances set down her cup. "I don't disappear," she said. "I believe that," said Mabel. "I hope you'll tell him." The opportunity came sooner than she expected. On the 9th day of her stay in Harlan Creek, a problem arrived at the ranch in the form of a letter from a man named Calvin Drury, who claimed to own the water rights to the eastern branch of the creek that fed the ranch's lower pastures. Drury was a land speculator who had arrived in Crockett County earlier that year and had been systematically acquiring water rights in the area, which was not illegal but was the kind of thing that could strangle a cattle operation if it went unchallenged. Robert came to Mabel's that morning with the letter and the flat, controlled expression of a man managing a serious problem. "Can I look at it?" Frances asked. He handed her the letter. She read it twice, asked him to bring her the original deed documents for the property, which he fetched from the ranch by midday, and sat at Mabel's kitchen table for the afternoon with the deed documents, the county land records that Mabel helpfully located from her post office files, and a piece of paper on which Frances wrote calculations with a focused, unhurried precision that made Mabel tiptoe around her own kitchen rather than interrupt. Robert sat across the table and watched her work. He had been prepared to ride into town and consult with a lawyer in the county seat, a 2-day round trip, but he found himself entirely unwilling to leave, partly because of the legal problem and partly for a reason he was not examining too closely. "Drury's claim is on the East Fork," Frances said, without looking up. "But your father's deed from 1867 includes a prior use easement on both forks of the creek as a condition of the original land grant. It's in the 3rd paragraph of the secondary deed, not the main deed. He would have had a different lawyer than whoever drafted the primary document, I think. The language is slightly different." She looked up. "You need a lawyer, but you have grounds. He can't displace a prior use easement without a court order, and his purchase predates nothing about your claim." Robert stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I can read," she said, "and I can read legal language which is just mathematics with longer sentences." She paused. "My father sometimes did books for a law firm. I sat in the office a great deal as a girl." He looked at the documents, then at her, and then he said very quietly, "Miss Merriweather, Frances." He stopped. She waited. "I would like to speak plainly," he said. "Please," she said. He put his hands flat on the table in that deliberate way of his. "I'm not a man who speaks easily about what he feels," he said. "I want you to know that I am aware of this as a failing. I was raised, my father was a man of very few words, and my mother spoke in actions rather than declarations, and I learned more of the former than I ought to have." He paused. "I have been watching you for 9 days, and I am aware that I was not watching any of the other women in the same way. I am also aware that the agency arrangement has nothing formally binding about it, and that you came here under a misunderstanding about whether I was even still seeking a match, and that you are owed complete honesty about where I stand." Frances set down her pencil. "Then tell me," she said. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are the most honest person I have ever met, and I think that the prospect of you leaving Harlan Creek is something I find." He stopped again, looking for the right word with a visible effort. "Intolerable," he said finally. which surprises me given that we have known each other 9 days. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare pecan trees in Mabel's yard. Robert, Frances said, and the use of his name without formality seemed to cost them both something, and also give something back. I came to Texas because the mathematics made sense. I did not expect the mathematics to stop being the point so quickly. She held his gaze. I am not going anywhere, he breathed out slowly. I would like to court you properly, he said. I am aware that the agencies generally expect a quicker decision, but I want— Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes to being courted properly, she said. Yes, I think that's exactly right. The smile that moved across his face was slow and somewhat helpless, and it made him look younger. All right, he said. Caleb Hurst, when informed of this development, said, "Good," and went back to his harness. The courtship that followed was the most genuinely alive period of Robert Ellsworth's adult life, which he would not have predicted and which he felt in the mornings with a physical quality, a brightness to the light and a particular awareness of small things, the color of the sky, the sound of boots on the porch boards, the smell of coffee, that he had not experienced since he was much younger and less guarded. He courted her as he did everything, honestly and with full attention. He borrowed a copy of a novel from Mabel Pruitt's small shelf and read it, because Frances had mentioned it once as something she loved, so he could talk to her about it. He did not tell her he had borrowed it, but she noticed the book on the seat of the wagon one morning and looked at him, and he looked back, and they both understood the communication that had taken place without a word being spoken about it. He took her to see the land properly, not as a prospective rancher evaluating an operation, but as something closer to how he saw it himself. The way the light changed on the hills at evening, the place along the creek where the cottonwoods grew thickest, and the water ran clear over pale limestone, the particular stretch of ridge from which you could see 50 miles of Texas on a clear day, flat and enormous, and full of a kind of silence that was not absence but presence. She stood on that ridge with him on a cold Tuesday afternoon and looked out at it, and he watched her face rather than the view, and what he saw there answered a question he had been carrying for longer than 9 days, longer perhaps than the months of the agency arrangement, longer even than his mother's last years of decline. It was the question of whether the thing he had built had any purpose beyond its own continuation. It did. He could see it on her face, the recognition of the land's genuine worth, and it meant more to him than he had understood it would. She, for her part, was discovering things about him that his letters had not conveyed, and that the careful presentation of a man in a formal courtship arrangement might have hidden, except that he was not built for concealment. He was unexpectedly funny, in a dry, understated way that required attention to catch. He was patient with his animals to a degree that told her something important about his character. He worked harder than any of his hired hands, and without the performance that some men bring to labor when they are being watched. He listened, which was a quality she had come to believe was rarer than most of its alternatives. He listened to her as though what she said was worth the full weight of his attention, and she had known enough people in her life who gave only the surface of their attention to other people's words to understand exactly how valuable that was. She also discovered, gradually, and with a care that matched his own, the shape of his grief. His mother's absence was present in the house in the way that the presence of the recently departed always is, in the small objects arranged just so, in the hesitation he sometimes showed before the closed door of what had been the back bedroom, in the stories that Bess Hurst told about Eleanor Ellsworth, with the particular warm specificity of someone describing a person they had genuinely loved. Frances did not push at this. She simply let it exist, acknowledged it when it surfaced, and did not try to fill the space it occupied with reassurance. He noticed this and said nothing about it for a long time, and then one evening on the porch he said, "My mother would have liked you." Frances looked at him. "Tell me about her," she said. He talked about his mother for an hour, which she suspected he had not done with anyone since the funeral, and she listened to all of it with the full, genuine attention that she had been given by him and was learning to give back. It was November still, cold in the evenings, and the stars over the Texas plain on clear nights were so abundant and so close that Frances, sitting on the porch with a quilt around her shoulders and a cup of tea going cold in her hands, sometimes felt that she was at the edge of something much larger than her own life. She was not given to sentiment, but this was not sentiment. This was fact. The land was large and the sky was larger, and the life available here was wider and more demanding and more genuine than anything she had been offered in Cincinnati, and she wanted it with a clarity that had nothing to do with Robert Ellsworth at all. And separately and simultaneously, she wanted Robert Ellsworth with a clarity that had nothing to do with the land. These two things were, she had decided, the point, that she wanted both for their own reasons, and not as consolation for the absence of the other. Towards the end of November, Calvin Drury rode out to the ranch. He was a compact, self-pleased man in a coat that was too expensive for the dust he was riding through, and he arrived with a companion who served no obvious function beyond looking significant. He asked to speak with Robert, and was told by Caleb that Mr. Ellsworth was in the east pasture and wasn't expected back until the afternoon. Then he noticed Frances on the porch, looking at the ranch's account books, and he said, with the particular condescension of a man who has never thought carefully about who else might be thinking carefully, "And who might you be?" "Frances Merriweather," she said, and did not elaborate. "You work here." "I am a guest of Mr. Ellsworth's," she said. "Can I help you with something?" he told her, in the broad terms of a man accustomed to not being challenged, that his water rights claim was solid, and that he expected Robert to come to the table and negotiate before the situation became unpleasant. Frances listened to all of this, and then said, with great pleasantness, "Mr. Drury, I've reviewed the relevant deed documents, and I should tell you that Mr. Ellsworth's prior use easement predates your purchase by 15 years. If you're intending to file a legal claim, you'll want to speak with your lawyer about that before you proceed, because I think it will save you an embarrassing outcome." She smiled at him. "But I'll certainly let Mr. Ellsworth know you stopped by." Drury looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man revising his assumptions. Then he tipped his hat, which may have been ironic, and rode away. She told Robert about it that evening. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Thank you." "I wasn't threatening him," she said. "I was just telling him the truth." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." They rode into the county seat 3 days later with the deed documents, where a lawyer named Haggerty looked them over and confirmed everything Frances had assessed. He sent a letter to Drury's lawyer, and Drury's water rights claim disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. Robert paid Haggerty's fee with the composure of a man who considered it money very well spent, and on the drive back to Harlan Creek he reached across the seat and took Frances's hand, which he held with a directness and a care that made everything perfectly, irreversibly clear. She turned her hand and held his back. They did not speak about it for several miles. They did not need to. He asked her to marry him on the 1st of December, 1882. He did it on the porch of the ranch house in the morning, when the air was cold and sharp, and the sun was just clearing the ridgeline to the east, and the light was coming in flat and golden across the whole front of the property. He had not rehearsed the speech, because any speech he rehearsed would have the life edited out of it, and he wanted the life in it. "Frances," he said, "I have been a very careful man for a very long time. I have been careful about the ranch, careful about the work, careful about what I allow myself to want. I don't think I understood that being that careful was its own kind of damage. And then you arrived without warning, and I found that I had forgotten every reason I had for being careful. Which is either foolishness," or he paused, "or it means something. I believe it means something." She looked at him steadily. The cold wind moved her hair. "I am 32 years old," he continued, "and this is the most important thing I have ever asked. Will you marry me, Frances Merriweather? Not as a convenience, not as an arrangement, but because I love you and because I would like to spend my life with you on this land and because I think we would be." He searched for the word. "Good," he said. "Together, in the fullest sense of that word." Frances breathed out slowly, and her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. She looked at the ranch, and then at the sky, and then at him, and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it, open in a way that she did not easily permit herself to be. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Frances Merriweather, "because I love you, and because the mathematics have been pointing this direction since the first letter." He laughed, and she laughed, and he stepped forward, and she stepped into him, and he held her with his arms around her and his chin against her hair, and the cold Texas morning was absolutely perfect. They were married on the 22nd of December, 1882, in the small Methodist church at the edge of Harlan Creek. Mabel Pruitt stood up for Frances, and Caleb Hurst stood up for Robert. Bess Hurst cried, which she would deny later. Sheriff Moorfield was there, and Gus Albright from the general store, who brought his entire family, including the 4 children under 6, and most of the rest of Harlan Creek, because there was not very much that happened in Harlan Creek that did not belong to the whole town in some fashion. Frances wore a dress that she and Bess had made together from the best fabric available in Crockett County, which was a very good blue wool with ivory trim, and she wore her dark hair up with a small cluster of dried flowers that Mabel had saved from summer and pressed carefully for the occasion. She walked down the short aisle alone, because she had no father to do it, and she did it with the same steady, direct quality that she brought to everything, and Robert watched her come toward him with an expression on his face that every person in the church saw and that Mabel Pruitt described afterward as a man who has stopped pretending to be unmoved. They said their vows clearly, both of them, looking at each other without flinching. Outside the church, in the cold December air, with the whole of Harlan Creek coming down the steps around them, Robert took both of her hands and said very quietly, just for her, "I'm glad you came without warning." "I'm glad the telegram got lost," she said. He kissed her, there on the church steps with their neighbors watching, and nobody in Harlan Creek pretended not to look. The first months of their marriage had the quality of discovery, which Frances had not expected, because she had thought she had done enough discovering in the courtship that the marriage would be more like occupation than exploration. She had been wrong. Marriage to Robert Ellsworth was a continuous process of finding new rooms in a house she had thought she knew, not dramatic or surprising rooms, but rooms that had always been there, solid and honest, waiting for the light. He was a careful and attentive husband, which she had expected. He was also, in the privacy of their own home, considerably less composed than his public manner suggested, and she found this endlessly charming. He laughed more easily now than he had in November, with less of the control in it, and the change was visible to everyone on the property. Caleb, who had worked for Robert for 12 years, told Bess one morning that the boss seemed like a different man, and Bess said that he was not a different man but a more complete one, and Caleb thought about this and agreed. Frances took hold of the ranch's accounts with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for a project equal to her capabilities, and the result, within 2 months, was a set of books cleaner and more detailed than any the ranch had maintained. She had identified 3 areas of unnecessary expenditure and 1 significant opportunity: a contract with a cattle buyer in Fort Worth that offered significantly better terms than the current arrangement in San Antonio, that Robert pursued immediately and closed within a month of her presenting the analysis. The difference in their operating costs in the first quarter of 1883 was measurable and real, and Robert looked at the numbers, and then at his wife and said, with great sincerity, "I should have married a bookkeeper's daughter years ago." "You should have," she said comfortably. She also, in those first months, made the house genuinely hers, not by changing it in ways that erased what had been there before, but by adding to it in ways that acknowledged the past while making room for the present. The back bedroom, which had been Eleanor Ellsworth's room and which Robert had not opened since her death, Frances asked him about directly one morning. She said she thought they might talk about what to do with it when he was ready. He had been quiet for a long time, and then he had said that he thought Eleanor would have wanted it used rather than kept as a shrine. They opened it together and spent a morning going through Eleanor's things carefully, keeping what was meaningful and giving the rest to a family in town who needed it. And then Frances cleaned the room and put fresh whitewash on the wall and let the winter sun through the window, and it became something new and still itself at the same time. He saw what she had done and stood in the doorway and did not speak for a moment, and she waited. "Thank you," he said. "She deserves to be remembered," Frances said, not closed away. He came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't know," he said, "that a person could do this." "Do what?" "Change everything," he said, "and leave everything that matters exactly in place." Spring came to Crockett County in March, and it came hard and fast, as Texas springs do, with storms that rolled off the Edwards Plateau and turned the red earth to red mud, and then sudden warm days of yellow sunlight that brought the prairie grass up green and thick and made the whole land smell like water and new things. Frances discovered that spring that she was pregnant. She told Robert on a Tuesday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table over the account books. She said it plainly and clearly, because she did things plainly and clearly, and watched his face. He went very still, in the way he did when something was large enough that he needed a moment to let it occupy its full space. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands, which she recognized as the highest register version of his affection, the full, unguarded version, and he looked at her with his eyes going gray with emotion and said simply, "Frances." "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I feel very well." She squeezed his hands. "Robert, say something real." He blinked. Then, "I am the luckiest man in Crockett County." "Good," she said. "That's a real thing." He stayed kneeling beside her for another moment, and then he pressed his forehead briefly against her hand, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and she loved him for it completely. Caleb and Bess received the news with the warmth of people who had been part of the land long enough to understand that a new generation was a serious and precious thing. Bess immediately began knitting and also compiling a comprehensive set of instructions about ranch pregnancy that Frances listened to with genuine attention, because Bess had borne 3 children and knew what she was talking about. Robert was, by any objective measure, somewhat difficult in the manner typical of first-time fathers, which is to say that he became significantly more attentive to Frances than he was strictly required to be, and she had to tell him on more than one occasion that she was pregnant and not ill, and that the account books were not going anywhere. "I'm aware," he said. "You've checked on me 3 times this morning. I was passing by." "You passed by twice and came back once," she said. He sat down across from her with the expression of a man caught fairly and accepting the verdict. "I don't know what to do with this feeling," he said. "I have been responsible for things that could be damaged before, the cattle, the land, but this is—" He stopped. "Different," she said. "Yes. You're going to have to let it be different," she said gently, "and also trust that I'm capable." He looked at her. "I trust you completely," he said. "It's the rest of the world I don't trust." "That," she said, "is something I understand." The summer of 1883 was a good one for the Ellsworth Ranch. The spring grass had come in thick, and the cattle were healthy. The Fort Worth contract was paying as Frances had projected it would, and the water rights situation with Drury had long since been resolved. Robert hired 2 additional hands to manage the expanded herd, and the bunkhouse acquired the busy, functional atmosphere of a properly running operation. Frances managed the accounts and helped with the correspondence and rode out less than she had in the winter because the summer heat was something they had agreed, with some negotiation, she would respect during the pregnancy. She did not stop working. This was not negotiable, and Robert had the good sense not to try very hard to negotiate it. She ran the household accounts and the ranch accounts and the correspondence, and helped best plan the larder for winter with the kind of systematic thoroughness that made everything run a little more quietly and a little more effectively than it had before. And she found in this work a satisfaction that was genuine and not merely dutiful. She also wrote letters. She wrote to her mother's sister in Indiana, her only remaining family, telling her about the marriage and the ranch and the pregnancy, and describing Texas in terms that she thought her aunt, who had never been further west than Illinois, might comprehend. She wrote to Dorothea Klein in Cincinnati, partly to keep her informed of the resolution of the administrative confusion, and partly because Dorothea had been kind to her and deserved to know that the outcome had been a good one. Dorothea wrote back with great warmth, and the news that she had matched 3 other women that year to Western ranchers with what she described as promising results, and Frances hoped they were all as well situated as she was. In July, a letter arrived from Robert's sister Catherine in Louisiana, who had heard news of the marriage through the third sister, Harriet, in California, and who wrote a long, somewhat cautious letter expressing both her congratulations and her concern. The concern being that she had not been present for the wedding and knew nothing about Frances, and worried about her brother in ways that were entirely understandable given that he had been, in Catherine's words, a man who needed someone and did not know it. Frances sat with Robert on the porch that evening and they read the letter together, and she said, "You should write back to her and invite her. She's in Louisiana." "The railroad goes quite a long way now," Frances said. "Invite her for the fall." He looked at the letter and then at his wife. "She'll cross-examine you." "I'm not afraid of questions," Frances said. "I usually have the answers." He smiled. He wrote to Catherine. Catherine Ellsworth Beaumont arrived in September with her husband Thomas and their 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7. And Frances received them on the ranch porch and shook Catherine's hand and looked her directly in the eyes. And Catherine looked back at her for a moment with the assessing gaze of a woman who has been worrying about her brother for some time and is deciding whether the worry can be retired. She was a tall woman, dark-haired like Robert, with similar direct eyes and a manner that suggested she had opinions and was not shy about them. "My brother," Catherine said, "has smiled more in the last hour than in the entire 3 days before my wedding, and I was living in the same house with him then." "He's a happy man," Frances said simply. "I think he surprised himself." Catherine laughed, which Frances took as a good sign, and it was. By the end of the first evening, the cross-examination that Robert had predicted had dissolved into something more like a genuine conversation between 2 women who respected each other's intelligence. And by the end of the visit, 3 days later, Catherine had pulled Frances aside and said quietly, with the directness that ran in the Ellsworth family like a vein of rock, "I'm glad he has you. I have worried about him since Mother died. He carries things too long." "I know," Frances said. "We're working on that." Catherine studied her. "You're a good match for him." "I know that too," Frances said, and smiled. Catherine's visit did something important that Frances had not fully anticipated. It made the ranch feel populated in a different way, the way that family does differently from neighbors and employees. The children ran in the yard and got into the barn and asked Caleb endless questions about horses with the fearlessness of children who have been told that questions are welcome. And Robert, who had never had young children around him in his adult life, was initially uncertain and then entirely willing. He lifted his nephew onto a fence post to see the cattle in the lower pasture, and told him their names with a seriousness that the boy received with equal seriousness. And Frances stood at the yard gate and watched, and felt something that was larger than ordinary happiness, a forward-looking feeling, a sense of what the land and the house were becoming. The baby came on the 6th of November, 1883, almost exactly a year after Frances had stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek. Bess Hurst served as the midwife, along with the county doctor, Dr. Phelps, who had ridden out from the county seat and pronounced everything as it should be before the process began. It was a long night, and Frances was, as she had predicted, capable, which did not prevent Robert from spending several hours on the porch in a state of controlled anxiety that Caleb sat through with him without being asked. "You've been through worse than this," Caleb said at one point. "No," Robert said, "I have not." Caleb considered this and said nothing further. At dawn, the baby's voice came through the wall of the bedroom, and Robert went very still on the porch steps, and then Bess opened the door and said, "Robert, come in." He had a son. A healthy, large-voiced boy with Robert's dark eyes and Frances's determined expression, who arrived in the world already appearing to have opinions about it. Robert sat on the edge of the bed beside Frances and held the boy in his large, work-hardened hands and looked at him with an expression that Frances could not fully describe, except that it was the most completely open she had ever seen him. Every guard down, every careful composition abandoned, just a man looking at the thing he loved. He looked up at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm very tired," she said, "and very well, and I am looking at two of my favorite people in the world." He reached out and touched her face with one hand, the baby in his other arm, and she leaned into his hand and closed her eyes for a moment. They named him James Benjamin Ellsworth, the Benjamin for Frances's father, and from the first days of his life he was the most important resident of the ranch. Mabel Prout came out to see him the following week and held him with the authority of a woman who has held every baby in a town for 30 years, and pronounced him excellent, which Robert took seriously. Bess knitted him more things. Caleb built a crib from cedar wood and gave it to them without comment, and Robert thanked him and they shook hands, and that was that. The winter of 1883 to 1884 passed with the warmth of a house that was full in the right way, the way that is not noisy or crowded but dense with meaning. James was a good baby, serious and observant in the way that Frances had been told she herself had been as an infant, and she found this privately very funny. Robert was a good father, careful, attentive, unafraid of the baby in the practical sense that some men are, willing to hold and comfort and sit up in the night when required. He was also, Frances noted, speaking to James with the same direct honesty he applied to everything, which meant that James received explanations of ranch operations in considerable detail at an age when other children were being told simplified stories, and she decided this was probably fine. The second year of their marriage had the quality of deepening, which was different from the intensity of the first year and, she thought, better in certain ways. The newness had given way to something more like bone, the solid, structural knowledge of another person that comes only from time and genuine attention. She knew the way he moved when he was tired versus when he was troubled. She knew the specific silence that meant he was working something out and needed to be let alone, and the different silence that meant he wanted company but didn't know how to ask for it. She knew that he woke at 4 in the morning 3 times a week to check on something he had not finished resolving the day before, and she had taken to waking too on those mornings and making coffee, and they would sit at the kitchen table in the dark house with the sleeping baby in the next room and talk quietly about whatever the unresolved thing was, and he had told her once that those hours were among his most valued in the week. She knew he thought that because he had told her so, which had become his habit, the deliberate verbal articulation of things he had formerly kept internal, a practice that did not come naturally to him, but that he had decided was worth the effort because she had told him early in their marriage that she could not read minds and would not try, and that the only version of partnership she believed in was the one where people said what they meant. She, in turn, had learned to let herself be known in ways that had never been safe before. She had spent years as a self-sufficient woman in circumstances that rewarded self-sufficiency and punished need, and the habit of internal management was deep. Robert had a way of watching her that made it clear he was paying attention to things she had not said, and she had learned, slowly and sometimes with difficulty, to let the unsaid things become said. They were careful with each other in this way, and also not careful, both at once, in the manner of people who trust each other enough to sometimes be careless. In the spring of 1884, the railroad came closer. A new line was being surveyed through Crockett County, and the surveys put it within 12 miles of the Ellsworth Ranch, which would change the cattle operation significantly. Robert had been following the surveys with the attention of a man who knew that this kind of change was coming and wanted to be positioned correctly for it. And Frances had been tracking the financial implications through the trade papers she ordered from Fort Worth. The railroad meant better prices, shorter drives, less weight loss on the cattle, and a more reliable market. It meant, in practical terms, that the ranch that had been barely profitable during the hard years could become genuinely prosperous. They spent a long evening at the kitchen table in April going over the numbers together, James asleep in his crib in the next room, the lamp burning low, and Frances laid out the case for an investment in additional acreage to the south, where the asking price was still low and the water was adequate. And Robert listened and asked questions, and pushed back on two of her projections with alternatives of his own, and they argued about it in the good-natured, rigorous way that they had discovered was one of their preferred forms of intimacy. "The South acreage is speculative," he said. "We'd be betting on the railroad moving fast." "It will move fast," she said. "The telegraph traffic indicates the company has financing locked and is moving to construction. I've been watching the reports." "You've been watching telegraph traffic for a railroad company. I've been watching everything that relates to our financial position," she said, with the mildness of a woman who considers this obvious. He looked at her across the lamplit table and smiled slowly. "All right," he said. "Tell me the full case again." She told him the full case again. He said yes. The South acreage purchase went through in June of 1884, and the railroad reached its nearest point to the ranch by December of that year. 12 miles and a spur line that Robert negotiated with the company alongside two neighboring ranches through the county's newly formed Cattlemen's Association, of which Frances had quietly done most of the paperwork. The first cattle from the Ellsworth Ranch went to Fort Worth by rail in February of 1885, and the difference in the price they received was exactly what she had projected, which Robert told her over supper with a combination of satisfaction and something that looked very like awe. "You knew," he said. "I calculated," she said. "It's not the same as knowing. It looked like knowing. The numbers were there, I just read them." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Frances," he said, "what did I do before you got here?" "You ran a good ranch," she said. "You were just running it alone." The spring of 1885 brought news from California. Robert's other sister, Harriet, wrote to say that she and her husband were planning a visit in the fall, which meant that the whole family would have finally been to the ranch at least once since the marriage, a fact that satisfied Frances on grounds she would have found difficult to articulate. She had wanted his family to know the ranch and see it as it was, not as something remote and half understood, but as something real, something worth having been built. She wanted them to know her too, not as an arrangement or a convenience, but as a person who had made her own choice and was standing by it with everything she had. Harriet arrived in October with her husband and their daughter, who was 4 and immediately formed a devoted attachment to James, who was nearly 2 and received this devotion with puzzled tolerance. The two children ran in the yard together, while the adults sat on the porch and talked about family and the land and the years between letters. And Frances listened to Robert talk with his sisters about their parents with an ease that had not been there in the one letter she had seen him write before Catherine's visit, a loosening in him, a coming home to the parts of himself that lived in connection rather than alone. That evening, after Harriet and her family had gone to bed in the guest room, and Caleb and Bess had gone to the bunkhouse, and James was sleeping, Robert and Frances sat on the porch in the October dark with the quilt around them both and the stars enormous overhead. "This is what it was supposed to be," he said. It was the kind of statement he made sometimes large and simple, requiring no expansion. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she said, They sat in the quiet for a long while, and the wind moved through the mesquite, and somewhere down toward the creek an owl called and received no answer, and it didn't matter. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When you got off that stage," he said, "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know you were coming. I had given up on the whole arrangement." He paused. "And I looked at you and I forgot." He stopped, looking for the words. "You forgot every reason you had," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." He turned his head to look at her in the dark. "I didn't know that was possible. I had been so certain of my reasons." "What were they?" she asked. "All this time I've wondered what the reasons were." He thought about it. "Fear," he said finally. "In several forms. Fear that the land was enough and wanting anything more was." He paused. "Asking too much. Fear that I didn't know how to be what a person needed. Fear that I would choose wrong and damage something. Fear," his voice was very quiet, "fear that I would love something I could lose." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. "Robert." "I know," he said. "You can't." "I know," he said. "I know the solution to that fear is not refusing to love anything. I know it now." He looked at her directly. "You are not something I am afraid of losing. You are something I am grateful to have. Those are different feelings." She reached up and put her hand on his face, which she did when words were not the point. He turned into her hand and closed his eyes briefly, and she thought about the distance between November of 1882 and October of 1885, 3 years and a marriage and a son and a ranch that was thriving and 2 sisters who had made the journey, and she thought that the distance was not very great at all, measured in the right units. "I love you," she said, precisely and without conditions. He opened his eyes. "I love you," he said, "more than I knew how to love anything when I started." In the spring of 1886, Frances told Robert she was expecting again. He received this news with slightly more composure than the first time, which she told him was an improvement, and he agreed. This second pregnancy was easier in some ways and different in others. She was more tired, which she attributed to chasing a nearly 3-year-old James around the ranch while maintaining the accounts and the household, and Robert made a genuine effort to share the load, which involved a renegotiation of who was responsible for what. That took several frank conversations, and resulted in an arrangement that was, she felt, both fair and functional. James was, by this point, a small, serious, determinedly curious person who had inherited equal amounts of his father's intensity and his mother's precision, and who was already, at 2.5, asking questions about the cattle that were almost more sophisticated than the answers available to him. Robert took this very seriously and answered everything as honestly as possible, and Frances sometimes listened to the two of them having these conversations standing at the fence in the afternoon, the large man and the very small person, both looking at the cattle with identical expressions of genuine consideration, and felt something that was simultaneously a specific kind of happiness and a specific kind of pride, not the comfortable pride of achievement but the live, warm pride of watching something you love be itself. The second child was born in November of 1886, a girl this time, healthy and loud, and immediately more interested in the world than the world was initially prepared for. They named her Eleanor Frances, the Eleanor for Robert's mother, the Frances a decision that Robert made without telling her until the certificate was written, at which point Frances had looked at him and felt her throat close with the particular emotion that comes from being known completely. "Eleanor Frances," she said when she could. "Eleanor deserved it," he said, "and so do you." She held the baby and looked at her daughter's face and thought of her father, who had taught her to trust numbers and to say what she meant, and of her father-in-law, who had started this land with nothing but belief, and of Eleanor Ellsworth, who had held it together through years of drought and grief and never stopped, and of Robert, who had learned to stop being afraid, and of herself, Frances Merriweather Ellsworth, who had put a carpetbag on a boardwalk in Harlan Creek in 1882 and crossed a dusty street toward a man she hadn't been warned about and hadn't looked away. The years that followed were the fullest years. Not the most dramatic or the most difficult, though they had both of those too, in the ordinary measure that any life includes them, but the fullest, in the sense of being densely occupied by things that were worth occupying one's life with. James grew up on the ranch the way that children raised on land grow up physically capable and practically knowledgeable in ways that children raised in cities are not, knowing the names of birds and the feel of coming weather, and the difference between a heifer and a cow at a glance by the time he was 6. He also, to nobody's great surprise, inherited his mother's aptitude for numbers and his father's aptitude for the land in a combination that Caleb Hurst described as potentially dangerous to neighboring ranchers, which was his way of saying the boy was extraordinary. Eleanor Francis, true to the character she had announced in her first moments, was not a quiet child. She had opinions early and loudly, and the combination of her grandmother's name and her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness produced a person who, by age 5, was regularly winning arguments with adults on points of logic that they had initially considered settled. Robert told Francis, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man reevaluating his expectations, that he had not entirely understood what he was in for when he chose that name combination. Francis told him he was doing beautifully. Caleb and Bess Hurst remained on the ranch, which felt right and inevitable. They were the continuity of the place, the memory of it, and as they grew older, Robert and Francis took care of them as they had been cared for in the early years, naturally and without ceremony. When Bess's back made the hard kitchen work difficult, Francis reorganized the household so that Bess could manage the parts she could manage and rest the parts she couldn't. When Caleb's knees started to trouble him on horseback, Robert hired a younger foreman named Price to take the field work and kept Caleb in an advisory role that suited the old man's dignity exactly. The town of Harlan Creek grew slowly over those years, as towns along the new rail lines grew. A second general store opened. The school got a second teacher. A doctor settled permanently in the town rather than riding circuit, which Francis had advocated for in a letter to the county commissioners that had caused some discussion. The church was enlarged. Mabel Pruitt continued to run the post office until she was 73 years old, and when she finally retired, she handed the role to a young woman who had just arrived in town and who Mabel described, with satisfaction, as sensible, which in Mabel's vocabulary was the highest possible commendation. Robert Ellsworth, at 45, was not the man he had been at 32. He was broader, slower to anger, quicker to laugh, and thoroughly, undeniably at home in his own life in a way that he had not been when Francis stepped off the stage and walked across that dusty street. He was also, by any measure available to Crockett County in 1895, a successful cattleman and a respected one, known for straight dealing and for the quality of his herd, and known also, though this was said in the warmth that attaches to such observations, for the fact that his wife ran the ranch's books, and that the books were among the finest in the county, and that when Francis Ellsworth had an opinion about land or cattle prices or railroad contracts, smart men paid attention. Francis Ellsworth, at 39, had done the thing she had come west to do, which was to find room enough for the full size of herself. She had found more than room. She had found a partner who saw the full size of her and considered it not a problem to be managed but a gift to be grateful for, and this was not nothing. It was, she had come to understand, rather a great deal. She kept the accounts and helped run the household and raised her children with the same combination of honesty and warmth that she brought to everything. And she loved her husband with a completeness that had grown rather than diminished over the years, which she had been told was what the best of love does but had not entirely believed until she experienced it. One evening in the autumn of 1895, with both children in bed and the ranch settled into the particular silence of a working property at the end of a good day, she and Robert sat on the front porch as they had done so many evenings, the sky enormous overhead, and the stars doing what they always did over the Texas plain, which was to establish without any possibility of argument that the universe was both vast and beautiful. Robert was looking at the stardark ridgeline, and she was looking at him, and he was, she thought, completely at peace, the specific peace of a man who is not expecting something to go wrong, who has unlearned the habit of waiting for loss, who has understood over years of evidence that love does not always take what it gives. "I was thinking today," he said without turning, "about the telegram that got lost." "I think about it sometimes," she said. "If it had arrived," he said. "If you'd sent word and I had been expecting you," he paused, "I would have prepared, I would have put on my careful face." "And," she said, he turned to look at her. "I think it might have taken considerably longer," he said, "to forget everything." She laughed softly. "You think the element of surprise did the work." "I think," he said, "that I had built very good reasons, and that the only way past them was to encounter something that made them irrelevant before I had time to activate them." He paused. "You were irrelevant to my reasons. You were simply Francis Merriweather," she said, "on a boardwalk with a carpetbag." "Yes," he said, "exactly." She leaned over and kissed him, because it was the exact right moment for it, and she had learned over 13 years of marriage to trust her judgment on such things. He kissed her back with the warmth of a man who has had 13 years of practice and has never for a single day taken the recipient for granted. "I'm glad," she said when they were done, "that I didn't know what I was walking into." "Are you?" he said. "The calculation beforehand would have been so careful," she said. "I might have reasoned myself out of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Could you have reasoned yourself out of it?" She thought about it honestly, because she always thought about things honestly. "No," she said. "I don't think I could have. I think it was going to happen regardless." She looked at the stars. The mathematics were already there. "I just hadn't seen the full equation yet." He took her hand and held it in the way he had held it since the day on the road to the county seat, deliberately, with the full intention of not letting go. "Tell me the equation," he said. "One woman," she said, "with a carpetbag and no warning. One man who forgot every reason he had. 1,600 acres of Texas plus the South acreage. 2 children currently asleep in their beds arguing in their dreams, most likely. One very good foreman. One very good friend who runs the post office. One lost telegram." She paused. Everything I have ever wanted." He was quiet for a long, rich moment. Above them, the stars burned steady and enormous in the Texas black, the way they had burned over this land for ages before any of them arrived, and would burn long after they were gone, indifferent to the small bright fires below, except that the small bright fires were, from close enough, the only light that mattered. "Everything I have ever wanted," he said, and it was not an echo but a statement of his own, full and exact and finally without fear. The mesquite moved in the night wind. Somewhere down toward the creek, something small made a sound. The house behind them breathed the sleeping breath of a house full of good things, and the land stretched away in all directions under the stars, red and enormous and entirely, completely home.